It was a bad time, 1920s. It was a depression was starting up.
Yeah.
And like most people, my parents moved in with their parents.
Yeah.
It was done everywhere. And really, that's the first generation when ordinary working people could buy their own home.
Yeah.
And it was very adventurous of them. And they were calling them dormitory suburbs, developing towns out of London because the electric railway, we were on the end of the district line. We lived about a mile from the station. So that's where people were living. So it was called a village, although out here it would be big enough to be a town.
Yeah.
And that was still with the old Tudor buildings, only a lot. Some had been bombed and some had been it was falling. Those old lath and plaster cottages.
So your parents were amongst the first?
The people that could get a mortgage, it was a 20-year mortgage, and they moved out of London.
Where did you go to school there?
So we went, it wasn't a village school like here is little. It was infants, girls and boys, a big brick building, because it was old farming country.
Yep.
School in Hornchurch, North Street, infants and then girls' school. And then we went on to, they talk about the 11 plus, but it was 10 plus, really, when you took the scholarship exam and you either went to high school or to secondary college.
Right.
And I got to high school, which my brother said, oh, it's only because half the people were evacuated that you couldn't look in. Because when the war started in 1939, a lot of people did move out, or their businesses moved into the country. And when fathers were called up, a lot of people, women and the kids, went back to live with their parents.
Right. Yeah. What work did your dad do?
Garden market, when it was the market. My Fair Lady, with the big little businesses importing and retail.
Yes.
The little greengrocers would come, often still with horse and carts or barrows, and buy their produce. And Dad got to know all the farmers around that supplied them.
Right.
And it was really interesting. Wow. One morning he got to work and found the building had been bombed, because in those days we didn't have phones. So until you turned up, you didn't know. So he had to he got another office and kept going there. But there was that risk all the way through. Our school got bombed towards the end of the war, but we had the shelters. And
you would remember all that because you were 10?
Yeah, when I started the high school in the Battle of Britain.
Gosh. And
when we stood in the garden and watched the planes and got yelled at by the air raid one, get back inside. He was out there watching, because whatever was shot, the shrapnel all came down. Yes. And then after, we'd go round and see who could find the most interesting bit of shrapnel, and we collected it. So.
And you would have seen the barrage balloons?
Oh, we had barrage balloons all around us, You'd watch them. Oh, balloons are going up, soon the warning will go, and then they'd take them down again. Oh, no, and they were just practising. And
people must have been like nervous wrecks.
No, they weren't. When you watch these awful films on television, people were terrified. They were not. They were angry.
Yes.
And they just got on with things.
Yes.
People went to work into the city.
Yep.
We went off to school. you had to take your gas mask. If you hadn't got your gas mask, you were sent home.
Right.
That's the one thing.
These boxes, like.
They were cardboard boxes to begin with. They didn't last long.
Yep.
And every fete, and there were fetes for Red Cross and things everywhere.
Yep.
People made all sorts of boxes covered them with all sorts of things. And I had a metal one because I carried it on the bike. We were calm. People never admitted to being scared. That is what people did. But I don't ever remember seeing that poster that they shove up everywhere now. It would have been laughed at, and people would have written funny things on it.
Right.
And
So did you have air raid shelters near you, or did you have
we had an Anderson. We had dug it out, and they supplied the metal frame. And then later they came and concreted them in to make them more waterproof. And after the war, Dad and my brothers, they carefully extracted that metal, like everybody did, and turned it into a garden shed down the garden. And the concrete stayed there as a pond. As far as I know, it's still there.
Wow.
It turned it into a goldfish pond.
Wow.
Everybody grew things on their shelters and made them fancy or gave them funny names. And people were much wittier in those days. Now they're so dull. There's one big one near us, Nil Desperandum, big sign on their things, but people called them all sorts of funny, cheeky names. And with that lovely mound, you could grow things. And my dad always grew a pumpkin because it got the full sunshine on that.
Tell me something about your school.
And we had people from maybe 10, 15 miles around came there. But it was only a couple of miles from home. So I got a bicycle to go on. And it was... The teachers were wonderful. Everything was so disruptive, like travel, everything, but school had to continue. And we were not allowed to make excuses for not having done homework because it was a bad night. You could have got on with it. So there had to be, it sounds hard, but think of the teachers trying to organise. And they didn't know, they tried starting the first lesson earlier or later, and because it's much darker in England. And then we had double summertime. Summertime, that came and went, but that was retained. And then in summer, we had another hour, because it was light so early that you got more benefit from the day.
So did you have brothers and sisters?
My two brothers, they joined the Air Force, like all the local people. They've gone now. And all through the war, the important person was the telegraph boy. And he delivered War Ministry telegrams around 12 noon. And people would find reasons to be at the front of their house or out at the gate, and they'd watch him come round the corner, and he went past that house. And my two brothers and two boys opposite were both they were flying, all of them, and went past, and they all survived. And down the road, one after another was lost. And watching that telegraph boy, no news is good news. You could breathe again. That was, but nobody made a fuss about it.
No.
How could you when everybody was involved? Like at school, they told us we weren't allowed to discuss what happened last night. Even if it meant going cross-country on buses or somehow you were expected to get to school.
Yes.
And it's going to be difficult for all of us. We all have our own worries, so let's not discuss them.
Mm-hmm.
We'll concentrate on education.
Yep. Right.
And you'd be in trouble saying that now. Tell me your problems,
Yes.
dear child.
Sure.
Oh. Once
Yeah.
in a way a teacher wasn't there and you wondered what had happened.
Yeah.
And we didn't have folders then, we used exercise books. And you filled them up and they lasted from 2 years sometimes. And one set was lost somewhere. And we just guessed that the teacher had taken it home and it was bombed and that was gone. But nobody told us.
Yeah.
They talk about the Blitz as if it was once. Those wartime programs, they're put together by young people and they don't seem to have talked to any old people or read old newspapers. They just think what happened to them.
Yeah.
No, the big Blitz, when Hitler realised he was going to smash London and they'll give you no time, then Churchill just says, we will never surrender. Forget that. And because we lived between the coast along the River Thames and London, and the docks and the factories were targets all through the war, they were targeted.
Yeah, yes.
And so they flew over our place.
Right.
And we always had the searchlight and the barrage balloons and anti-aircraft guns.
Yeah.
They were always firing, and you had that noise of firing, and you got to recognise the different guns where they were by the sound. Oh, now old Charlie's popping up. You could hear them. Nobody was terrified. They all thought they would survive. And it's our country, and you get out of it. And people were calm. I used to sit under the table when it got very noisy. Imagine now, doing my homework on my knee. We had a big, solid table. And my mother, who was a character on her own, she would not go in that shelter because there were spiders in there and beetles. I'm not going to be buried alive because of some so-and-so Jerry. I'll die in my own bed. And she wouldn't even want to come downstairs. But my brothers and I, they were home on leave or anything, we had our beds downstairs. But they stayed up all the time, and you'd hear chink, chink on the roof when shrapnel fell. In our town, you weren't supposed to talk about where things happened, but we had one neighbour, eccentric in every direction, and she'd call out, "Come on, girls, get your bikes, we'll go and see where they landed." And she always was riding out, looking to see what was bombed and where. And we had railway sets, because front bit by bit they bought more rails and more trains, and it was laid out. And we played a lot with that. We had a big recreation ground, I suppose half a mile down the road, and you were supposed to come home if the siren sounded. And you knew what to do if there was noise overhead. Lie down, cover your head. And we never had to do it, to our disappointment, because it would have been fun. No, we went out to each other's houses a lot, not for play dates, they talk here. So why don't they just call on each other? Especially once you've got a bike, you could call on each other or go for a ride and see what's happening. It wasn't a sad time. And when people got a telegram, we always had morning assemblies, big prayers every morning. And you knew that someone was sad or maybe weeping a little bit. And the rumour would get round, oh, they had a telegram. And that was as far as
Yeah.
the sympathy
Yeah.
went. I wanted to study agriculture. I wanted to feed the world.
Yes.
And to go to agricultural college, it was really only a dream because I never could. But you had to work on a farm for a year before they take
This is
you.
where the land girls come.
Dad talked to his farmers, and I got to work in Suffolk.
Right.
I think it's the most wonderful place. He had more animals than most people,
Yeah.
and there were pigs, Essex pigs.
Yeah.
Here you get Wessex pigs, but and Suffolk sheep
Yes.
and Suffolk horses.
Oh, there's beautiful Suffolk sheep. Yeah, I know them. Yep.
And I was in heaven working with them, and I lived with a very nice family.
Uh-huh.
And nowadays people couldn't do it. They call it manual labour, and they wouldn't want to do anything. No, 18 months I was there.
Yeah, right.
I was there for the coldest winter they'd had for umpteen years, and freezing and snow, and then we had a sort of flood afterwards, and then the next summer was beautiful, just perfect. And
Yeah.
the crops ripened, and
Yes, yes.
that's how it was.
Fabulous. Like a forerunner to do agriculture.
Yeah, you had to have worked, and you couldn't work on your family farm. You had to go and get experience.
Uh-huh.
By the time I'd been there, people were being demobbed everywhere, and they were giving priority to ex-service persons, naturally.
Yeah.
So there was no point in
Yeah.
applying anymore.
Yeah.
And under pressure of my mother, I went back home and got office jobs like every other girl in the
Yes.
neighbourhood did.
Secretarial work, yes.
So I worked at May and Baker's. I was a filing clerk, which sounds awful now, but it was in the medical department, and it was, you had to read and know what was going on,
Yes.
and that was interesting.
Yeah.
And when I mastered that, really, after a year, and I got a job as a bookkeeper. They don't do that now. But you have long columns of figures.
Double entry stuff.
Yes.
Yes.
And I worked in the city, and when weather was fine, I took my sandwiches and sat down by the Tower of London.
Oh, wow.
And there were tourists a little bit
Yes.
at that time, but it was never crowded,
No.
except with office workers,
Yes.
all sitting, eating
Right.
their sandwiches.
Yes.
They didn't go and buy lunches
No, no.
like now. It was up on the embankment.
Yeah.
But you could
Yeah.
get down and,
Yeah.
yes.
I'm reading a book at the moment, and it's about mudlarking along the Thames and all the finds that they've
It's
found.
incredible, isn't it? Even now they're finding historic stuff.
Yeah.
It's like the river was a lot wider and wilder,
Yes.
and then it was dug into channels, and
Yes.
then it was cleaned up,
Yep.
and now it's nice. There's even
Yeah,
got
yeah,
fish back
it is.
in it now.
Yeah.
But,
That's right. So after bookkeeping, what did you do then?
I was spending more and more time like with Sunday school kids and
Oh yes.
with the brownies and cubs.
Yes.
And one day I was on the bus and looking in at classroom windows, and I thought, gee, that would be nice.
Yeah.
And I did think about it.
Yeah.
As a Christian, I live by faith,
Yes.
and I think it was a prod. And then our next door neighbours had some visitors. They were matronly old school teachers, and we were talking a lot. And they said, why don't you do teaching? It's great.
Yeah.
And I thought, why not?
Yeah.
Oh, my mother, of course, was disgusted. Oh, just suit you. Yeah, just suit you being a real old, what was it? Spinster schoolmarm.
Oh,
That's
no.
what she said. And I applied to Essex County because then that's when the baby boomers were coming
Yes.
in 1950.
Yes.
All those hundreds of little children. And the schools they were packed. They tried to keep each class below 50. And that's how it was. And they couldn't get teachers. And I just applied, and there wasn't really a proper interview or anything. I just filled in the forms. And they sent me to Southhorn Church, Raynham, which was down by the river, one of the roughest areas. I went down there, and he was principal, was headmaster in those days. Welcome in, come and sit down, and I'll explain what we'll do later, and then we'll let you float for a while to see what happens. And as we'd sat there, he was getting one call after another from people who weren't coming. And he was trying to get emergency teachers, which were hard. And he said, look, do you think you could mind, like it was grade 2 class, and just till I get things sorted out? Off I went, and I had them just before playtime. He put his head in the door, things going well? And I, a leader, I just worked with them. I was later on, but not then, no, but I did a lot with Sunday school kids. And it was when we had parties, and then we didn't have entertainers, you played games. And I found I could organise kids very well. And then you had to have applied to a college. And I got the booklet, and there were teachers training colleges everywhere. And recently they had been taken over by the Ministry of Education. So a lot had been set up by churches and missionary colleges and things. So they could keep their own character, but they had the same exams, the same curriculum, really. So they were controlled. In sheets and sheets all about yourself, what you did and your hobbies and everything. And St Catherine's at Tottenham, White Hart Lane, accepted me. So in 1950, I went to Teachers Training College, not knowing what to expect, thinking, it's like a boarding school, because they were all residential, and be full of silly schoolgirls, and look, it was lovely. I think it's one of the best times ever.
You would have been 21 then.
I was 21 then, and there were other mature-aged students, they called us, who, if you had worked and been self-supporting, you got your board in the college free, £30 a year grant for books. I got 2 years, very intensive, because study hours were, you could come and go as much as you liked, but the study hours were till 9:30 at night. If you wanted to go out or go to the pictures, you had to sign, and then sign when you came back in, so that they knew, because it wasn't a very nice area. No, we had a lot of fun just among ourselves, none of us having spare money. There were we who had worked, and there were the private school people, some of them boarding school people, so that we all mingled very well. It was, I can't remember any unpleasantness. There was chapel night and morning you could go to, and it was just, everyone was enthusiastic, like now, and we had to do 3 hours reading from any education book in the library and just record it. Jane said, how do they know you did it? You could have just written down books. I said, no, we didn't. And if somebody got something interesting, it was passed around the whole group, and you talked about the job. And it was a lot of fun as well.
I'm thinking you lived away from home when you were working on the land, so that would have been when you were 17, 18. and then came home for a little while, and then off to Teachers College again. No wonder you were an independent young woman at 25 heading off overseas.
It's a time when a lot of Australian girls were going to work in London.
Yeah, that's true.
That was-
So why did you decide to go to Australia?
No, the people I lived with in Suffolk on the farm
Yeah.
were Australian.
Ah,
They had come over before the war
right.
and, of course, couldn't go back.
Yep.
So we kept in touch.
Right.
So that was the big interest in going to
Yes.
Australia.
Right.
And I went, they live near Perth.
Yep.
They got a poultry farm
Right.
and I came out to see them.
Yep.
So that's what, everything does connect.
Our conversation roves around a bit here because Beryl starts talking about the man that she was to marry later on, Karol, how he was in Czechoslovakia and escaped in 1946 and went to Germany and eventually ended up as a refugee here in Australia.
And put into hospital, and the doctor there hung on to him as long as he could.
Yeah.
When they came to get him, to arrest him, oh, he's not ready, he can't walk,
Yeah.
which he could. And then one Sunday afternoon, some visitors left a bag of clothes on the bed and a message, you better go. He had to walk out. And it was a known route that was closed soon after he got into Germany. And suddenly Germans were his friends and rescuers, and he was starving because he walked and walked. And
this would be,
I think 46 by then. Yeah. The woman in the station, he said, is anywhere to eat? And she said no, and then she got out her own lunch bag and gave him half the food.
Our conversation moves to when Beryl first came to Melbourne.
Pictures of when we were in Tasmania, Melbourne, back in the 1950s. And I've got a box full of travel stuff, brochures and things like that. That's how big Melbourne was.
Wasn't it amazing? Oh, God. Where did you live there in Melbourne?
And we lived in South Oakley.
Yeah.
I was 25.
Oh, gosh. Gee.
I came for 1 year.
So how did you end up in the Pilbara?
I was in Western Australia.
Yeah.
And I taught in Pingelly, that was 100 miles out of Perth.
Right.
And then for 2 terms. And then I was transferred to Roban to fill in where the schoolmaster's wife, who had run the school, the native school, went down to Perth to have a baby, and they wanted someone short term. I never heard that word Pilbara while I was there.
Right.
It was a vague comment.
Yes.
And it was all sheep stations.
Yeah.
And Karratha. I've got a photo somewhere of sitting in Karratha when it was
because that's
Karratha was the sheep station there, and that's all there was.
Wow.
Spinnifex and sheep.
I looked it up. It was like hundreds of miles from Perth, wasn't it?
1012, I think.
Gosh.
Because I'd never flown. I lived near Aerodrome when I was young.
Yep.
And my brothers, like all the boys in the neighbourhood, all joined the Air Force. They all wanted to fly, and I never did. And then I was sent a ticket to fly to Rome, and I couldn't tell them, I'm not going in a plane. It wasn't the best of journeys. We got there early in the morning.
Yeah.
Oh, they had to change the engine in the plane.
Oh, my God.
So we stayed hanging around the airport for hours, and then they took it up for a test flight, and finally we got in. And we landed at 4 places because the plane followed the coast, and the plane landed and took off 4 times before we got to Robins, and it was bumpy.
Yeah.
But we did get there safely, yes. And I think now, why did I do that? Why didn't I do something? Why didn't I do it differently? But back then, people weren't travelling that much.
No.
And there was no proper road. Do you remember the Red X road
I do
trials?
remember the Red X.
Young fellow up there who'd recently bought the service station, and then this was announced, and he had all that trade, all the vehicles and their support groups came through.
Oh, very good.
So he had done very well out of that. Yeah. But
Looking at a photograph of St Catherine's Teacher Training College, which was the first teachers' college training in England, actually, started in the 19th century.
where did you find that? I never. My study, that was my room.
Oh my goodness me.
Study bedrooms.
Yes.
In different wings. They had a chapel, a nice chapel,
Yep.
with an organ, and the music lecturer was actually training overseas students from missions and places on the organ.
Oh.
Yeah, there was chapel, and there was breakfast, and then most lectures were nearly an hour. We had a mid-morning break.
Yep.
You didn't have lectures the whole time because there was study in between, but that was a timetable, and it went through till we had an hour for lunch.
Yes.
And in the afternoon there was space for 2 more lectures, and then we had supper, and then we had another lecture. It was now when they say about working, I think you couldn't have a job. You were really in it.
Yes.
And because we all lived there, we all read and studied the same sort of thing. And because it was a church, have you heard of the SBCK?
No.
The Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge.
Ah.
They ran originally, although now it was under the London University, took over all of them, but they could still run in their own way, but they had the same curriculum and exams. So they had to follow all the missions and the schools, like there was a Methodist and Baptist, and they all had colleges.
I found these really nice photos of Suffolk sheep, Beryl.
They shipped some of the breeding stock out to first the Channel Islands when they were
Jersey and
to build up their flocks, and some went to the Argentine as well, and I don't know where else.
I read that some came to Australia.
Yes.
They look beautiful, didn't they?
They look neat and tidy,
They do.
and
They do.
it's like with dogs, their faces are all different.
Yes.
Like the shepherds knew them, really.
Yes. Yeah.
And
That's interesting, because I always think almost of the anonymous sheep. You wouldn't know one from, I wouldn't know one from another. But these had individual sort of faces.
But so have the white sheep. It's the way they... What's the farming program on Sundays? Anyway, they were talking about the export of live sheep. That's the most wicked thing you could do. You take them from wide open paddocks and squash them up together. And it's wrong. And here, they just like the early settlers, they let them go.
Yes.
And they've never ever developed shepherding or looking after them or feeding them properly. And someone said, oh, we got an 86% lambing rate. And I thought, 186, you could say, because they should each have twins if you fed them.
Right.
And The foxes and the dogs get them. Don't let them get out there and look after them.
Yeah. What was it that motivated you to want to be an agricultural scientist? Was it the work your dad did?
We lived on the edge of the country.
Yeah.
And we always walked in the country, and I don't know, I never had a dog. I wanted a puppy so badly. Every birthday, every Christmas, and I never got one. Yeah. Where did that come from? And I used to walk the neighbours' dogs and collected.
Tell me about your dad's work at Covent Garden. What was it he did?
When he came out of the army at the end of the First World War, it was a case of get a job anywhere. And they don't talk about it now, but there was terrible unemployment. And he'd gone to school till they were 14, like they all did. He must have been pretty bright. But there was no follow-up, but there was night school. Yeah. And he did bookkeeping and things. That was really all he knew, and he got this job in the early 20s. Yes. It must have been. And it just happened to be in Covent Garden Market. Right. And that's where he was. Right, yeah. And later on, there were lots of little businesses in those days, and slowly they got gobbled up by the big businesses. Yeah. But they imported, that finished with the war, of course. We always had boxes and things at home from where he brought stuff home. And I always remember Grenoble's walnuts. So, right, yes. And then during the war, of course, there were so many regulations on farmers, what they had to grow. Yep. And the market was watched to make sure there was no black market, unofficial handling. Yeah. And he just was really in a little business. You do everything. You do the bookkeeping, you do a little bit of the selling and contacting farmers everywhere. Right, yeah. And it was
amazed that you lived on the edge of countryside.
It was a village. Yeah. And they had built these estates during the Depression time when farmers were walking off, and there were lots of fields of thistles and rough land. On your bike, you could, in 5 minutes, you'd be out of Hornchurch and you'd be in the country. Oh.
You said that they had wattle and daub houses
cottages
there.
In the village. All the workers. There were lots of Tudor style where the upstairs
leaned out
over. Yeah. There was rows of them, but they were sinking, and often you had to step down as you walked into them, and the floors were like that, and quite a few got demolished just before the war. Yeah. And then during the war, of course, more got demolished. There were about 6 or 7 pubs, the White Hart and the Bull's Head and Checkers, all of them. Yeah.
So pubs there was so much different to our pubs, which never really became pleasant places to be. But back in England, they were.
They were centres, yeah. And they played darts, and there would be music if someone felt like playing, and they were different. They were like clubs, and you either went to that one or to that one, I think, but none of my family drank, so we didn't have much to do with it.
When you came to Australia and taught near Perth, and then got transferred because the teacher had a baby and had to go.
I was in Pingelly first. That's in the wheat and sheep belt. Yes. And I loved going to the junior farmers meetings, and I learnt a lot. And the people there were all very friendly. It was a nice school. And then I went to Robin. I had a native class that had been formed. They'd had a cyclone the year before.
Yes.
And they were just repairing the school.
Right.
I think the white kids met in the Masonic Hall,
Yep.
where there were 2 teachers.
Yes.
And I had the native class. There were lots of big old stone buildings there from the early people knew how to build.
Right.
They didn't get blown away. No, it was the gold.
Right.
They had gold, and there was a port there. Cossack was. I'd just given the book to Sally, Cossack gold, how it was discovered, because gold was lying on the ground in little lumps. And someone was up there surveying, and he said, I picked up a stone to throw at the crows, and he didn't say the rest. And someone said, did you hit them? And he was meant, it's heavy and it's gold.
Oh, right.
And it was lying around.
Good heavens.
And then they started little mines.
Did you love teaching the kids or not?
Oh, they were lovely kids.
Yeah.
They were friendly.
Yes.
And they tried. They did all speak English, although they had their own.
Yep.
And sometimes we'd sit down and we'd work out list of words in their language and in English, and how on earth would you spell them?
Did you stay up in
It was only for a term, really.
Yep. And then you went back to Pinchley? Or?
No, then that was the end of the year.
Yep.
And I couldn't get a ship home for a few months,
Yep.
so I'd have a look. Up in Roban, the pay was so good because you got out of town pay, and they paid some of the hotel allowance to get teachers to go there.
Yeah, remote.
And there was absolutely nothing to spend money on, so I saved.
Yeah.
So then I travelled. I went on the trans train.
Yes.
Over to Adelaide, and then to Sydney and Brisbane, and then I worked in Mackay for a few months.
Oh, right.
And then I went up to Darwin and came down. And
did you enjoy being in Mackay?
in those days you could walk into a job anywhere.
Yes.
And I became a nurse's aide, a nursing aide, and I worked in the hospital there.
Oh, okay, hospital. Yeah.
It was all sugar plantations,
Yes, of course.
and a lot of them had been taken over by Maltese people.
Oh.
They'd come there to work, and the locals, I don't know, walked off or gave up, but they could all work very hard and helped each other.
Yeah.
And they didn't want their daughters being nurses or working for someone else. They wanted them to stay home.
Right.
But they were working there, so I got to know some of them.
Right. Were you there for long? A matter of months? Or?
Just months, yes.
Yeah.
And I was there for a small cyclone in the end of February, when, you know how bridges up there don't have side rails?
I don't know.
No, they did. They were just flat because of all the debris that would sweep down.
Of course, yeah.
And a lot of the bridge over the Pioneer River there was washed, and we took off our shoes and just left them on the bank, and we walked over the remains of that bridge. Talk about stupid. And it was interesting because I didn't even realise that was what a cyclone was. We lived in the nurses' quarters.
Yes.
And to get across to the building, we had to crawl. The wind was so hard, you couldn't stand up in it. And you had to crawl over
It would have been a small hospital, like maybe 50 beds or something? Or...
Oh, I had quite a lot.
Oh.
Had different wings, because I think it was the only one for, I don't know how many miles.
Hundreds of miles, yeah.
Oh, there were people from everywhere. They were all talking and happy, and in those days beds were lined up down a ward.
Yes, of course,
so everybody knew everybody's business there.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, Darwin was nice, the beaches were nice. Yeah, I went down to Hobart and then came back to Melbourne and sailed home through the Panama. That was nice. So I had been right round the world.
Yes, you had. So that was a couple of years, was it?
That was end of 56. Yeah.
Right.
And then I taught in England for a while. By then I'd met Carol and he wanted to come, but because he still had no passport, he couldn't come to England. So we decided I'd come back here, and I applied, not expecting they'd say yes, to come back as a migrant, and they said yes. Mm-hmm. So I had to wait till I got a passage.
So where did you meet Carol then?
In Sydney Zoo.
Oh, really?
We just got talking.
Yeah. So he stayed in Australia and you went back to...
Because he was still a refa, or a new Australian in those days.
That's right. Yeah.
And he could go anywhere in Australia, but he couldn't get a passport.
Yeah. So you taught back in London, did you?
In Hornchurch.
Oh, yeah.
In the new estate, they built 1,700 council houses, like the state houses. And they naturally put in a new school. It was good, and we had a very enthusiastic headmaster.
Yes.
Hard, and yes, it was a good place to be.
And were you there for a year or longer?
Or 18 months.
Yeah. Yeah.
Our school certificate, you had to pass all subjects. Yeah. And I didn't. I used to get 15% for maths because I just didn't bother. And we had a wonderful teacher there, and there weren't many doctors in education then, not women. And she mostly taught the senior students and got them scholarships to uni and things. She was wonderful. And she took on this class of maths students, and she'd say, see you struggling. She said, can't you do that? I'll show you how. And she did.
Yes.
And you could do it. And she was she didn't try to be nice and friendly. It was just how she was.
Yes. Right.
And I passed, so I got matric.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
You had to pass in a lot of subjects to be granted matriculation.
Right.
Otherwise it was, I did have it here in an envelope, but I don't know.
After you and Carol got married, you went to live in Tasmania, is that right? And you were teaching there?
It was so rigid and old-fashioned, and it was everything that we had been told not to do. Yeah. And they were a bit showy about having a pommy, and very much then. Now, when I realised what it was like, and then we had the 3 little girls, and I didn't want them growing up there.
Yeah, of course.
Carol didn't want to move because the newsprint mill was a very good job.
Yep.
I only got him as far as Melbourne. We had planned to go to a country town somewhere.
Yes.
And then the man in the union office told him, oh no, you better stay around the city. You won't get anything anywhere else. Mm. So we stayed in the suburbs, which isn't really where we wanted to be, but it gave the girls a chance to. Yeah. 2 of them went to Macrob.
Oh, good school. Yep. Yeah. Did anyone become a teacher?
in your family?
No,